She walked into the hospital just after sunrise, holding a paper cup of tea and greeting every nurse by name. No rush, no fear, no sign that her entire life was built on a lie. To everyone in the room, she was Margaret Halley, a soft-spoken volunteer who spent her mornings reading to patients in the long-term care wing. But what no one knew, not the staff, not the state, not even the family she'd grown close to, was that this woman wasn't supposed to exist at all. And on that same morning, across town, an analyst inside the Indiana State Police headquarters stared at a computer screen that refused to make sense. A DNA hit Fanti. Partial and older than most of the evidence archived in the system had just linked a 54-year-old missing child case to a living person. Not a relative, not a descendant. The system was saying the impossible. The missing girl was alive. The analyst checked it again. Then, again. Same result. Same name. Same match. Ella Brooks, missing since 1961. 6 years old, presumed dead for half a century. The discovery sent a quiet tremor through the department. Supervisors were called in. Old files were hauled out. And within minutes, that long-buried pink ribanda one recovered from the Brooks front yard all those decades ago finally had something to say. But here's the real twist. The woman who matched the ribbon's DNA wasn't living under her own name. She wasn't living with her own history. And she wasn't living anywhere near the life she'd been born into. For 54 years, she'd moved from one small town to the next, reinventing herself every time the past got too close. So how did a 6-year-old vanish without a trace, only to walk among us as a completely different person? That's the mystery we're about to unravel. Before we dive into this chilling story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe for the full investigation. The ribbon was stored in a brittle evidence envelope so old it looked ready to crumble. But inside that fading plastic sleeve sat the only physical trace ever recovered from the Brooks front yard. A tiny pink bow, once bright and playful, now dulled by decades of dust and storage. When Ella vanished in October 1961, investigators believed it was nothing more than a child's lost hair accessory. A heartbreaking symbol? Yes, but not evidence, not proof, not a map to anything useful. They were wrong. When the Cold Case Division reopened the file, 54 years later, the ribbon was almost dismissed again, until a junior tech noticed something trapped in the fibers, a microscopic smear, smaller than a fingernail clipping, lodged deep in the threads. Modern DNA tech didn't exist when the ribbon was first logged, but now it was enough. The lab didn't expect a full profile, maybe not even a partial, but what they extracted was far more unsettling. The DNA belonged to a female. A living female, and not a relative unidentical match. And when the analyst typed the name into the internal dot, the entire office fell silent. The profile belonged to a woman who had filed state volunteer credentials 3 months earlier under the name Margaret Halley. She lived only 40 miles from the original crime scene, the same distance the unknown suspect's car had been seen driving toward on the day Ella disappeared. It shouldn't have been possible. A missing child couldn't file volunteer paperwork. A missing child couldn't walk into a hospital every morning. And yet, the math didn't lie. This wasn't just a cold case anymore. It was a breach in reality, itself a 54-year-old ghost, suddenly breathing the same air as her own investigators. And the question wasn't what happened to Ella Brooks. It was, who raised her? State detectives moved quietly. No patrol cars. No sirens. Just a quiet stakeout outside a modest rental home off Union Street. A neighborhood where porch lights stayed on and everyone waved to everyone else. And there, stepping out with a tote bag full of children's books, was the woman calling herself Margaret Halley. She didn't look dangerous. She didn't look frightened. Say, look ordinary. But that was what unsettled the detectives most. Because if this woman truly was Ella Brooks, then half a century of her life was missing an entire unwritten chapter of American history living inside one person. They followed her routine for days. Every movement, every errand, every face she interacted with, and everything about her seemed built on habits, not memories. No childhood photographs. In her home, no relatives. No personal mementos older than 20 years. Her life started abruptly, as if someone had pressed record in the middle of a tape, and detectives noticed something else. She avoided cameras. She angled away from store security lenses. She paused before entering any public building with surveillance. Not out of fear, but out of instinct. An instinct taught, not inherited. Finally, investigators obtained a warrant for a covert DNA collection. A discarded teacup from her hospital volunteer shift was enough. The lab returned the result in 8 hours. Exact match. 0 deviation. The same DNA taken from the Brooks ribbon. This woman wasn't a relative. She wasn't a coincidence. She was Ella. And yet, every trace of the original Ella Brooks' birth records, her school files, her medical history had been scrubbed clean, replaced with forged documents that appeared decades older than they actually were. Someone hadn't just hidden her. Someone had rebuilt her. With the DNA. Match confirmed. Detectives returned to the one lead that had haunted the original investigation. The silver-haired woman seen driving a light blue Ford Fairlane. The day Ella vanished. In 1961, the witness description had been considered unreliable. The observer was 12 years old, frightened and unspecific. But now, with new technology and modern profiling, the Cold Case Division reconstructed the sighting with forensic precision. What they uncovered was chilling. The Fairlane had been registered to Martha Lloyd, a traveling foster care coordinator who operated independently in rural Indiana. During the late 50s and early 60 segundos, she moved often, avoided official state documentation, and was last recorded working with children in unregulated placements. At the time, nobody questioned her. Her references were handwritten, her credentials informal, and her routes unpredictable. But her disappearances matched toll, most perfectly with unsolved child vanishings across 3 states. Detectives cross-referenced the old registration logs with census movements, hospital volunteer records, and newly digitized welfare archives. And a pattern formed every time Lorian relocated. A child disappeared and a new family friend or distant aunt appeared months later in another state with a young child who carried no birth certificate. Lorian had vanished for good in 1974. Presumith, dead. But one of the children she abducted had lived on. Built a life. Built habits. Built an identity from nothing but survival. And while the detectives now knew who took Ellis, they still didn't know why. Why abduct a child and never harm her? Why erase her past, but not her future? Why raise her with care and lies? One last file, buried deep in a county basement, would force detectives to confront the truth behind Lorian's motives. A truth darker than kidnapping. A truth older than Ella's disappearance. A truth about the woman who shouldn't exist, and the woman who made sure she did. The deeper detectives dug, the stranger this case became. Every piece of evidence they touched felt like it had been staged, polished, or planted by someone who knew exactly how investigators worked. The woman who shouldn't exist wasn't just a mystery. She was a ghost built out of deliberate misdirection. Detectives started with the obvious. The motel room where she was supposedly last seen. A cheap roadside place, tucked between an empty highway and a broken-down diner. The kind of place criminals use when they want to disappear quietly. At first glance, the room looked untouched. No fingerprints on the faucet. No hair in the drain. No trace of DNA anywhere, not even on the door handle. That's impossible for a living human being. It was almost like she floated into the room, hovered for an hour, and drifted back out. But then, a single thread. A ragged receipt from a convenience store to towns over. A time stump. A location. And a security camera facing directly toward the cashier. Detectives rushed to recover the footage, expecting to finally see her face. Instead, they found corruption literally. The entire file was glitching, frozen, or blacked out at the exact 5-minute window she supposedly bought snacks. Long before modern deep, this kind of precision meant only one thing. Someone tampered with the system, but the receipt had her signature, and that was the biggest twist. Forensic handwriting analysts swore it matched the name she gave the motel. Eleanor Shaw, a name that belonged to a woman who died in 1998. The signature wasn't forged. It was hers from someone who legally couldn't be alive. Detectives now faced a scenario that sounded insane on paper. Either someone copied the signature of a dead woman with perfect, microscopic precision, or the woman walking around the Midwest was using the identity of a corpse. Both explanations were bad. One pointed to an expert-level criminal. The other hinted at something bigger, something involving stolen identities, buried files, and a shadow network capable of rewriting a person's existence. One detail stood out. On the receipt, next to her signature, she scribbled a second word, barely noticeable. Just 5 letters. Thorn. Detectives didn't know whether it was a clue, a warning, or a name. But they would soon find out. And that's when the investigation took its darkest turn. The name Thorn gnawed at the lead detective, like a loose thread on a sweater. Pull it long enough, and the whole case might unravel. So the team ran it through national databases. Nothing. Nothing. Not as a business. Not as an alias flagged by federal agencies, but buried deep in an archived intelligence memo. Sold at wasn't even digitized day. Found the first real spark. Thorn wasn't a name. It was a classification tag used by an off-the-book surveillance group in the early 2000s. A defunct unit, supposedly shut down for ethical violations. What kind of violations? Nobody knew. Files were redacted so heavily the pages looked dipped in ink, but one line survived. Subjects flagged under Thorn display. Irregular data trails and inconsistent identity markers that matched their mystery woman perfectly. Fake name, dead identity, missing prints, and a trail that felt intentionally scrambled. Detectives drove to one surviving member of the disbanded unit, a retired analyst living in rural Tennessee. Old, paranoid, still convinced the government listened through light bulbs. At first, he shut the door. But when they showed him the signature, Eleanor Shaw, his hands started shaking. He invited them in without another word. Inside his dusty living room, he explained the truth. Back then, Thorn wasn't chasing criminals. They were tracking people who didn't officially exist. Ghost eats, paper trails with no origins, birth certificates with missing people who appeared suddenly in adulthood with perfect records that started nowhere. And every Thorn subject shared 3 traits. They used the identities of the dead. They stayed off dash grid. They always ran from something. The analyst looked at the detectives like he wished he could unremember the past. Then he whispered, "If she's Thorn class, you're not investigating her. You're following the consequences of whoever created her." The room went quiet. The air felt heavier. Detectives now had a shocking realization. This woman wasn't simply an alias thief or a runaway. She was tied to a forgotten intelligence operation with reach far beyond state lines. And the next lead hidden inside Thorn's old case logs would reveal exactly what she was running from. If Thorn once tracked people like her, then maybe one of those old cases held the key. Detectives dug through the files. The retired analysts reluctantly surrendered boxes filled with faded photos, numbers scribbled in margins, and incident reports that read more like ghost stories than federal documents. One case stood out, a 2004 alert report from Lexington, Kentucky. Female subject, age 20 to 25. Using identity of deceased child. Last seen, speaking with handler. Possible extraction attempt. Subject fled before interview. The photo attached was grainy, but the facial structure matched their woman. Same sharp cheekbones. Same guarded eyes. Same expression of someone who'd lived 2 lives and trusted neither. Detectives needed confirmation, so they tracked down a name written on the back of the file. M. Dalton. Field contact. A man who once claimed to have seen the subject hours before she vanished. When they located him, he was living in a nursing home, barely responsive and fading into dementia. But when they mentioned the name Eleanor Shaw, his eyes snapped alive like someone flipped a switch. He whispered, "She wasn't supposed to be here." Detectives leaned closer. Dalton struggled to piece memories together, but fragments spilled out fragments that made the case darker than anything they expected. He remembered the woman. He remembered her fear, and he remembered meeting her behind an abandoned gas station, where she begged for help and told him someone was hunting her. Not a stalker. Not a jealous partner. An agency one he described only as an invisible hand. Dalton said she tried to hand him something. A small, metal capsule. But before she could explain it, a black SUV rolled up, and she ran. He never saw her again. That capsule was never recovered. No report mentioned it. No evidence log stored it. It simply disappeared like someone erased it from reality. Detectives left the nursing home shaken. For the first time, they felt the boundary between a cold case and a cover-up blur, and they still didn't know who the invisible hand was. But the next lead would force them to confront the truth Hedenby else had been watching their investigation from the shadows since day one. The moment detectives walked out of the nursing home, the atmosphere changed. A black sedan idled across the street. No plates. Tinted windows. The kind of vehicle federal contractors use when they don't want to announce who they work for. At first, detectives brushed it off. But then, it started following them. A slow, calculated tale. Not sloppy. Not hostile. Observational. Someone had just discovered they were reopening a case that had been buried for nearly 20 years. Back at the precinct, things got worse. Their digital files glitched. Notes vanished. security logs rewrote themselves, and the hard copy of Dalton's testimony locked in a cabinet was missing an entire page. The same page where they wrote the word capsule. Only 3 people had the key, which meant someone inside the building was watching. 2. That night, the lead detective found an envelope taped under his windshield wiper. No return address. Inside was a single Polaroid photo. A woman walking through a grocery store parking lot. Head down, hood up, but unmistakably her. The timestamp was from 2 days ago. Their ghost wasn't a relic from an abandoned intel program. She was alive, moving, and staying just close enough to be seen but never caught. And someone else was tracking her movements in real time. On the back of the Polaroid, in sharp, hurried handwriting, was a message. Stop digging. You're not ready for what she knows. This wasn't a cold case anymore. It was an active operation, and detectives were stepping into a battlefield they didn't understand. Every clue they uncovered made the woman less of a fugitive and more of a warning one wrapped in stolen identities, shadow surveillance, and a truth powerful enough that someone was willing to rewrite history to hide it. And now, the shadows watching the detectives were getting bolder, because the next move in this silent war would come not from the woman they were chasing, but from the people chasing her. The Polaroid changed everything. Until now, detectives believed they were chasing the ghost of a past Operation An identity thief who slipped through the cracks. De cabeza. Go. But the timestamp on that photo snapped reality back into focus. She was alive. She was moving, and someone was close enough to monitor her within 48 hours of the investigation reopening. Detectives studied the photo like it was a crime scene. The angle was low, the focus slightly off. Whoever took it was hiding behind something, maybe a car door, maybe a truck bed. The woman's stride was measured, deliberate, like someone who knew she was being hunted but refused to break into a run. Her hoodie shadowed her face, but her posture told the truth. She wasn't living. She was surviving. The grocery store was an hour away from the last confirmed sighting. Detectives drove there immediately. They expected a quick surveillance pull, maybe a credit card trail. Instead, they found another vacuum, no digital footprint, no paper trail, no sign she ever bought anything. The store cameras worked perfectly, except for one camera. The one pointed at the exact aisle where she walked. Static, corrupted. A square of black pixels in an otherwise pristine security grid. That corruption pattern matched the earlier gas station footage. Someone wasn't covering her tracks. Someone was covering their tracks. Outside, a store employee stepped forward timidly. He recognized the woman from the Polaroid, said she looked exhausted, paranoid, and kept glancing over her shoulder like she expected trouble. He also remembered one detail. She asked if the store had a payphone. The question confused him. No. Body asked for payphones anymore. Not in this decade? But when he told her there wasn't one, she left immediately and didn't look back. Detectives expanded the radius. They checked bus stops, diners, rundown motels. Nothing. No digital purchases. No cell signals. No witnesses. She left behind the faintest trace, a single piece of gum wrapper near the dumpster. The brand was a vintage mint-flavored, discontinued years ago. You couldn't buy it in stores, but prison commissaries still stocked it. For older inmates, that was the first real crack in her disguise. She wasn't hiding from the law. She might have been hiding because of the law. And that led detectives to a new question. What kind of woman lives like a fugitive when she's never been charged with anything? The gum wrapper led investigators to correctional archives. If she recently left a facility, official or unofficial, there'd be a record somewhere. But the search didn't turn up a release form. Instead, it revealed something far stranger. A missing inmate file. Not deleted. Not archived. Just gone. Like someone sliced it neatly out of the system. The absence was suspicious enough, but the missing file belonged to a woman with the same height, same build, and same approximate age as their subject. Name? Dana Merritt. Arrested 12 years ago. Convicted of federal fraud involving forged passports and birth certificates. Sentenced to a high-security facility in Ohio. Sentenced to a high-security facility in Ohio. Kicker? There was no official record of her release. A mid-level federal warden confirmed quietly that Merritt wasn't just any inmate. She was classified under a restricted program tied to identity reconstruction. The kind of program built for informants, infiltrators, and assets who needed new lives. But when detectives pressed harder, the warden's tone shifted. He wouldn't talk about her last year inside. Wouldn't say if she was alive or dead. wouldn't even admit she ever walked out the front gate. Before they left, he said something that sounded less like an answer and more like a warning. Some people don't get released. They get reassigned. That single word, reassigned, it harder than a confession. It implied she was part of something bigger, something experimental, something their department had no clearance to touch. Back at the precinct, detectives connected the dots. Dana Merritt disappears. A woman using the identity of a dead miner appears a few years later. A shadow unit named Thorn tracks people exactly like her, and now someone is erasing every step she takes. The conclusion was terrifying but unavoidable. She wasn't a fugitive. She was an asset gone rogue. Assets don't run without reason, and handlers don't chase them unless they're carrying something explosive. Detectives finally understood the stakes. This wasn't just a cold case. They were tugging the edge of a classified operation built on erased identities, lost years, and secrets buried deeper than federal ink. And the next clue would come, not from her, but from someone following the detective's every move. 2 days later, the first direct contact arrived. A plain brown envelope slipped under the precinct door. No return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a message typed on a mechanical typewriter, old-fashioned, untraceable. She's not what you think. Stop chasing ghosts. Below the message was a symbol the retired analyst recognized instantly. A small, coiled vine with a thorn piercing through a circle. The emblem for Thorn's internal clearance tier. Not public. Not feel it. Not feel it. Known only 2 members of the unit's SOMAN in seat. Thorn, or whatever was left of it, was watching them. The lead detective decided to push back. He sent a secure inquiry up the chain, hoping for clarity. Instead, he received a call from a federal liaison who never gave his name. His voice was calm, polite, and chillingly practiced. "We appreciate your enthusiasm," he said, "but this investigation intersects with ongoing federal concerns. You're advised to stand down." They refused. Within an hour, their office network went dark. Phones rerouted. Case files locked automatically behind a firewall they didn't install. It wasn't a request anymore. It was an order. Still, they moved forward offline. Old-school notebooks, maps, yarn lines, and then a break. Traffic cam footage from an industrial area on the outskirts of town. A woman crossing the street alone, hood up, face hidden, but irgait, identical. She was heading toward a decommissioned warehouse once used by Thorn for behavioral evaluation. Detectives stormed the place, expecting confrontation. Instead, they found a room stripped bare except for a rusted metal table and fresh footprints. She had been there hours earlier. On the table, she left a laminated badge, cracked, bent, a photo of her face, young, tense, guarded with the label, Identity Prototype Class, C. That changed everything. She wasn't un informant. She wasn't an asset. She was an experiment. And the people who created her were still out there. The badge unlocked a new theory, one that chilled detectives more than any shadow agency. If she was a prototype, what exactly was she built to do? And why did she run? For answers, they needed someone who worked directly in identity architecture. That led them to Dr. Roslyn Haley, a former behavioral specialist who resigned from a federal contractor 13 years ago. She lived quietly, far from any city, raising chickens on a farm that looked lifted out of a pastoral postcard. When detectives showed her the badge, her face drained of color. She didn't deny it. She didn't stall. She simply sat down and whispered, "I knew this day would come." Haley explained everything. Thorn's last phase wasn't about surveillance. It was about manufacturing clean identities. People who could infiltrate deep cover environments with erased pasts and reconstructed memories. They weren't brainwashed. They weren't clones. They were real people, with parts of their histories intentionally shredded and rebuilt. Dana Merritt volunteered, Haley said softly, but she didn't understand the price. The program tested memory suppression, emotional rewiring, and identity layering. And something went wrong. Dana began recalling fragments of her original self-names, faces, mistakes. The layers clashed violently. Panic attacks, blackouts, fugue states. Thorn labeled her a malfunctioning prototype and scheduled her for neutral restructuring, a sanitized term for permanent removal. She escaped the night before the procedure. Haley helped her flee, believing Dana deserved her own life. Not one engineered by a program obsessed with perfection, but once Dana surfaced again, all old protocols reactivated. Even dismantled units left behind ghost handlers, contractors, watchers eager to recover the runaway asset. Haley warned detectives with quiet urgency. She isn't dangerous. She's terrified. She's running from people who refuse to let her become human again. But there was one more revelation, a bombshell. Dana wasn't running aimlessly. She was trying to reach someone. Someone she remembered, but wasn't supposed to. And that brought detectives to their final pursuit. Dr. Haley gave detectives one last name, a Calvin Rohudka, a former field handler fired after the program collapse. Not for incompetence, for disobedience. He refused to participate in identity restructuring and publicly called the project a violation of human continuity. He vanished soon after. But people don't really disappear. Not handlers. Not assets. And definitely not men who once protected experiments the government wanted erased. Detectives traced him through burner addresses, temporary jobs, off-grid cabins. Finally, they found him working at a silent lighthouse on the edge of Lake Superior. Forgotten. Perfect for a man who spent years hiding from his own past. When detectives arrived, Rourke didn't react with fear. He reacted with resignation. "You're here because of her," he said, almost relieved. "She's close, isn't she?" They showed him the Polaroid. He closed his eyes. "She came to me once. She said she remembered my voice before she remembered her own name." Rourke explained he was assigned to Dana during early testing. Unlike the others, he treated her like a person, not a prototype. When she realized the program intended to erase her again, he helped her escape, but he warned detectives of something much darker. "She's not running toward me. She's running toward the truth they buried inside her." Her memories weren't just scrambled, they were implanted, layered intentionally. And inside those layers was information the program needed back at any cost. A blueprint, a breach, a secret she carried unknowingly. Rourke stepped aside, revealing a backpack on the table. Inside was a burner phone with a single unsent message from Dana. "I remember the capsule. I'm coming to finish it." The capsule Doherty mentioned. The same object erased from every record. The reason the shadow agency stalked her. Detectives stood at the edge of a revelation powerful enough to burn every clearance level in the country. Dana wasn't just trying to reclaim her life. She was trying to expose something her creators thought they destroyed forever. And now, the race to find her would become a race to survive the truth she carried. Rourke's revelation changed everything. Until now, the capsule was a rumor, an object mentioned once by a fading witness, erased from every log, and ignored by every agency that should have cared. But Dana remembered it. Not fully, not clearly, but enough to know it carried a truth someone wanted dead. Detectives analyzed the message again. "Remember the capsule. I'm coming to finish it." The wording was deliberate. She wasn't searching or wandering. She had a destination. Rourke explained the capsule's origin. It wasn't a weapon. It wasn't evidence. It was a memory vault, a micro-device used during Thorne's early experiments. Instead of inserting data into a subject, it extracted their unfiltered memories, unaltered and impossible to tamper with. The prototype version held a person's true identity, preserved like a digital heartbeat. Dana's capsule contained her original life, who she was before Thorne rewrote her. But Thorne didn't destroy it. They lost it. And if Dana had tried to hand it to Dalton that night, only to be interrupted, it meant she intended to expose the entire operation, long before she disappeared. The bigger question wasn't where the capsule was. It was why she suddenly remembered it now. Rourke hinted at the answer. Memory layering eventually collapses under emotional stress. Dana's resurfacing memories weren't random. They were triggered by something or someone. And if she was reclaiming fragments from her original life, she was dangerously close to recovering everything Thorne buried. Detectives followed her trail north, believing she was heading towards someone connected to that lost past. They checked bus tickets purchased in cash, forest trails with fresh footprints, and roadside diners where she left faint traces an untouched coffee, a crumpled napkin, a scribbled word. Home. The question mark wasn't a clue. It was a plea. She wasn't just running from Thorne. She was running toward the place. She used to belong where she hoped the capsule might still be hidden. And if detectives didn't find her soon, someone else would. The same shadow agency that erased their files was already on her path. And they weren't coming to recover her. They were coming to erase the last person who could expose them. The coffee shop napkin. Scribble HOME gave detectives their first real direction in weeks. They dug into Dana Merritt's pre-arrest life, searching for relatives, childhood addresses, any location she might consider home. Most records were sterilized by Thorne, but one address survived in a paper archive. A farmhouse on Route 19, abandoned for over a decade. The location matched her movement north. It was the only thing that made sense. When detectives reached the property, it felt wrong immediately. Not because it was abandoned, because it didn't look abandoned. The lights were out, but the grass was trimmed. The windows were clean, and the porch boards, though weathered, showed footprints, fresh footprints, leading inside. They drew their weapons and entered slowly. The interior was a time capsule frozen in 2007. Family, photos on shelves, a half-knitted blanket on a couch, a calendar pinned open to a month 13 years past. Nothing had moved. Nothing was disturbed, except one thing. A coffee mug on the kitchen counter, still warm. Dana had been there. Minutes earlier, detectives searched the rooms with quiet urgency. Upstairs, they found a bedroom that didn't fit the rest of the house walls stripped bare. Bed removed, carpeting pulled back. In the center of the floor lay a square of loose boards arranged with purpose. Underneath was a metal lockbox the size of a paperback. A box meant to hide something precious or dangerous. But before they could open it, a floorboard creaked behind them. Dana stood in the doorway, hood still up, eyes exhausted, hands trembling not from fear, but from years of running. She didn't speak at first. She simply stared at them, assessing whether they were a friend or a threat. Then she pointed at the lockbox with a shaking finger. "That's my life," she whispered. "The part they stole." Detectives stepped forward slowly, assuring her they weren't with Thorne. She believed them, but she wasn't relieved. She was haunted. She explained the house wasn't her family home. It was her constructed home one, THORN used during her memory layering sessions. None of it was real. None of it belonged to her. But the capsule was. As she knelt beside the box, tears gathering but never falling, she whispered, "I came back here to remember who I was." Before they could open it, a distant engine rumbled down the dirt road. Thorne had found them. The farmhouse went dark as headlights cut through the trees outside. A black SUV. Tinted windows. No plates. The same vehicle that tailed them before. Dana. Frosi. Her breathing quickened. The trauma of a decade bled into the room. "They're here," she whispered. Detectives shut off their flashlights and crouched behind the furniture. The lockbox stayed between them and opened, glinting faintly in the moonlight like a truth waiting for courage. Footsteps crunched on gravel. Doors open it. Heavy boots approached. Not local police, not federal agents with badges. This was a retrieval team, silent, coordinated, and trained to reclaim runaway prototypes. Dana shook violently. "They're not taking me." "Again, I won't disappear twice." The lead detective, heart pounding, made a choice. "No protocol allowed. You're not going anywhere." Shadows moved past the window. Someone tested the doorknob. Another circled toward the back entrance. They were setting up a containment sweep classic pincer maneuver. Before the breach, Dana grabbed the lockbox and forced it into the detective's hands. "If they get me, protect this," she said. "It's the truth, not just mine. Everyone's." The door exploded inward. Men in dark tactical gear stormed the living room. Quiet, efficient, anonymous. The kind of men who didn't write reports and didn't leave bodies behind. Detectives fought, ducking behind the couch as shots cracked into drywall. Dana sprinted toward the staircase, drawing attention away from the officers. She moved like someone who had escaped before, someone who knew how these teams worked. But one of the operatives cut her off, pinned, cornered, out of breath. The lead detective tackled him, buying her seconds. She bolted through a side door into the fields behind the house. The retrieval team splits them, chasing her, others searching for the lockbox. Detectives held their ground long enough to escape through the kitchen window, sprinting into the night with the box clutched tight. They regrouped at the tree line just in time to see Dana in the distance, darting between rows of tall grass as headlights swept across the field. Then dashed silence. No shots. No screams. No footsteps. Just the hum of the SUV driving away. With Dana inside. The capsule was now the only thing standing between truth and extinction, and detectives had just inherited a war they never asked to fight. Detectives chose a quiet, windowless interview, room-neutral walls, soft lighting, nothing that could trigger panic. When Margaret entered, she looked calm, almost peaceful, unaware that her double life was moments from collapsing. Detective Harris began gently. No accusations. No pressure. Just questions about her past, her family, places she'd lived. At first, she answered confidently. Routine. Rehearsed. But then Harris asked the one question she hadn't planned for. Do you remember the name Ella Brooks? Her reaction wasn't dramatic. No gasp. No then yell. Only silence long. Cracking silence that filled the room. Her fingers trembled. Her jaw tightened. Her eyes shifted downward as if the past had finally caught her. When Harris slid the faded school photos across the table, she froze. A 6-year-old girl with a red ribbon. A girl who vanished in 1961. A girl whose DNA matched hers. Her breathing changed. The decades of buried identity finally surfaced. And when she whispered, "I didn't run," I was taken. Everything in the investigation flipped. For the first time in 54 years, she said her real name out loud. My name is Ella. Ella Marie Brooks. Her voice cracked not because she feared consequences, but because she had spent an entire lifetime believing no one would ever know her truth. She explained how she had been taught to forget who she was, how every birthday passed without a number, how every move erased another piece of her identity. Yet the memory of one thing survived, the pink ribbon her mother tied in her hair the morning she vanished. That, she said, was the only thing she kept hidden through every new name, every new town, every new life. The woman who stole Ella had lived an astonishingly normal life. Neighbors described her as polite. Co-workers said she was private. Doctors said she was stable. But her past told a different story, one of obsession, delusion, and a desperate need for a child she could never have. Police discovered she'd moved. Ella at least 9 times across 3 states. Always choosing places without digital footprints decades before background checks became routine. She controlled everything. Ella's schooling, friendships, medical records, even her birthdays. Medical records, even her birthdays. She taught Ella to believe 2 things. Her real family never wanted her. Authorities were dangerous. This manipulation kept Ella silent long after her captor died. She wasn't hiding from justice. She was hiding from ghosts she believed were real. Ella struggled to explain how she lived a full adult life without knowing who she truly was. She worked countless jobs under different names. She never married, never had children, never stayed anywhere long enough to feel safe. She described her life as a story written by someone else. Detectives realized they weren't speaking to a criminal, they were speaking to a survivor who had spent 54 years locked inside an identity she didn't choose. For the first time, Ella asked a question she had feared since childhood. Is my real family alive? Detectives couldn't immediately answer, but they knew what they had to do next. When investigators contacted the surviving Brooks family members, disbelief turned into overwhelming emotion. After half a century of pain, the possibility that Ella was alive seemed unreal. Her older brother, now in his 60s, had spent most of his life advocating for missing children. He still kept her toys. He still visited the empty field where she was last seen, and every year, on her birthday, he placed a new pink ribbon at her memorial. When police finally confirmed the DNA match, he collapsed into tears. Not grief this time, relief. After 54 years, his little sister had finally been found alive. The moment Ella and her brother met, the years evaporated. The man who had once been a boy running through the autumn leaves of Bloomington now stood in his 60s, shaking with disbelief, tears streaming down his weathered face. Ella froze for a second, unsure how to bridge decades of absence, fear, and lost identity. When he extended his hand, she hesitated, then wrapped her arms around him. Every year of searching, every sleepless night, every unanswered prayer seemed to condense into that single embrace. The pink ribbon, now tied loosely around her wrist, caught the morning light, a silent symbol of childhood memories reclaimed. Detectives and social workers observed quietly, letting the moment unfold. No words could encapsulate the trauma, the loss, or the relief. After decades of uncertainty, the family's circle was whole again. Ella's brother whispered her name repeatedly, confirming that she was real, not a ghost, not a phantom of memory. And Ella, for the first time in over 50 years, allowed herself to cry. Not for the past, not for the stolen years, but for the future. She finally had a chance to live. News of the discovery spread faster than detectives anticipated. Within hours, local stations picked up the story. Headlines flashed across screens. Indiana cold case solved after 54 years. Missing girl found alive, and Ella Brooks reunites with family. Reporters descended on Bloomington. Cameras flashing, microphones thrust forward. Every neighbor, every childhood friend, and even strangers who had followed the case for decades wanted to witness the miracle. Detectives managed press briefings carefully, emphasizing facts over sensationalism. They highlighted the tireless work of investigators, the courage of Ella, and the importance of victim-centered storytelling. Despite the frenzy, Ella remained composed. She declined interviews, requesting privacy, and focused solely on the family she had been denied for over half a century. The media attention, though intense, could not overshadow the deeply personal triumph of a life reclaimed. Rebuilding a life after 54 years of erasure was daunting. Ella met with therapists, social workers, and former law enforcement officials to process her trauma. Every recollection, every suppressed memory, became a piece of a puzzle she was finally allowed to solve. She learned to navigate normal life against simple things like choosing a favorite meal, a daily routine, or even trusting strangers. The world that had moved on without her was unfamiliar, yet, for the first time, it felt hers. Her brother remained by her side, patient and unwavering. Together, they revisited the places of her childhood, retracing steps she barely remembered. Each walk, each photo, each small memory reconnected her to the identity stolen decades ago. Detectives continued to monitor loose threads from the Thorn operation, ensuring no remnants threatened her newfound stability. Their work extended beyond the arrest to revelations they were guardians of a life once stolen, now finally returned. Authorities moved swiftly against remaining operatives connected to the Thorn program. Investigators compiled decades of evidence, linking illegal operations to identity theft, falsified records, and human experimentation. While some operatives had long vanished, arrests and indictments followed, bringing justice to those responsible for decades of manipulation and trauma. Courts labeled the program unprecedented in both scale and severity, acknowledging the lives permanently altered. Ellis's name was officially restored. Legal documentation corrected every fabricated record. And finally, after 54 years, the case reached its full resolution. The victim reclaimed, the perpetrator held accountable, and the shadow of the past finally illuminated by truth. As detectives closed the file, they knew this wasn't just a solved cold case. It was a story of survival, resilience, and the unyielding pursuit of justice, a narrative that would inspire families, investigators, and generations to come. Years after the rescue, Ella Brooks began living a life she had been denied for more than half a century. No longer defined by someone else's narrative, she rebuilt her identity from the ground up. She chose her name, her home, her career, and her passions. Every decision, every choice, was a reclamation of autonomy stolen decades ago. She returned to Bloomington often, revisiting the quiet streets where her childhood had been erased. The pink ribbon that had once been left behind now became a personal symbol of survival. She tied it in her hair on special days, not to remember pain, but to honor the strength it took to survive. Her family became the anchor she had longed for. Celebrations, birthdays, and holidays, moments that should have been hers as a child were now lived fully, surrounded by those who never stopped hoping she would return. They shared stories, filled in gaps, laughed at memories she didn't know existed, and mourned those that could never be recovered. Though the trauma lingered, Ella found solace in helping others. She became an advocate for missing children, speaking quietly but powerfully at foundations and community centers, reminding the world that hope can endure, even when decades pass. Her story was no longer just about being found, it was about surviving, reclaiming, and thriving against impossible odds. The Thorn program, dismantled by federal authorities, became a cautionary tale. Investigators, haunted but proud, continued to study the case, using it as a blueprint to uncover other forgotten operations, proving that even in the darkest shadows, truth and justice could prevail. Ella often reflected on the paradox of her life, taken from the world as a child, yet returning with an unbreakable spirit. 54 years had passed, but her life finally chosen, fully her own, was a testament to resilience, courage, and the enduring power of hope. In the end, the case wasn't just solved. It was a victory for every voice silenced, every story left untold, and every soul still waiting to be found. And for Ella Brooks, it was finally her story to write.